Then I started to listen to alternative health shows, which led me to hear more about the nature of consciousness and energy and psychic phenomena and things like that. And the more I heard about those topics and started to read books and scientific papers, I realized, whoa, if even 1% of this is true, I have to rethink my very existence. And and yeah, that's putting it mildly, because I was,
Yeah.
who am I? What am I doing here? Everything I used to believe was true might not be. And most of the people in my family and personal and professional networks are not even thinking about this stuff. What's going on? Because at the time, I didn't know there were huge communities of people that were already familiar with this. And basically, since then, I've been on a nonstop journey to rethink all of my paradigms.
This is Spirit Gym. In today's episode, Paul is talking with Mark Gober, the award-winning author of the Upside Down book series of 7 books, spanning the topics of consciousness science, spiritual awakening, political and economic theory, UFOs, the Great Reset, medicine, cosmology, and more. Thank you for listening to this podcast, which would not be possible without you, our subscribers, and also our premier sponsors, Organifi, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, and Wild Pastures. The sponsors' special offers and discounts are mentioned throughout this episode, or you can visit the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast.
All right, everybody. As you heard in Penny's introduction, our guest today is Mark Gober, the author of The End to Upside Down Everything. And probably more to come, I'm sure. And so today we're going to have an amazing tour of Mark's book series. So each of you gets a chance to really have a sneak preview of what's in these books. And I highly recommend any of them that interest you, you buy. They're all extremely good. So Mark, welcome to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek.
Paul, thank you so much for having me.
And I'm excited to dive into your books because you'll help me know which ones to start reading next. Your books cover a wide variety of topics and some deep topics as well. So to begin our journey together, can you share your background and what led you to devoting so much of your life to researching and writing each of your books?
What's interesting, Paul, is that the topics I write about now are not ones that were really on my radar for the majority of my life. I grew up with a very mainstream perspective. I went to Princeton for my undergrad, and I was a competitive tennis player. I was one of the captains of the tennis team there. And then, like many of my classmates, I went into finance because that was the thing to do. So I worked at UBS Investment Bank in New York in 2008. This was during the height of the financial crisis that I was there. It was not a very healthy time mentally or physically for me, and I knew it was not what I wanted to do. So I ended up joining a firm in Silicon Valley, actually first in the Boston office, but the majority of time in Silicon Valley, advising technology-focused companies on their intellectual property, meaning their patents, their business strategy, and their technology strategy. But there was a theme as I was going through all of this stuff, as I was trying to accomplish on a treadmill, basically, which is that I didn't have a sense of meaning or purpose other than trying to achieve and win the next thing that was ahead of me. And I think one can only go on for so long like that without starting to break down. And that's what happened to me. But interestingly, as I was breaking down, let's just say when things didn't go the way that I wanted professionally or personally, I was not looking for a new way of viewing life. I thought as I became more educated and as I got older, that life was fundamentally random and meaningless. In other words, there's no meaning built into the fabric of reality, and that we can make up meaning, but we're just trying to rationalize because there is no higher intelligence that governs the universe. And certainly when our body dies, there's no continuation to our consciousness. It's just lights out. So it was a very nihilistic, materialistic view, and some would even call it atheistic or agnostic. And I was squarely in that perspective as I was not feeling as well as life progressed. Fast forward to 2016, still working in Silicon Valley, and I started listening to podcasts. Not looking for anything new, but sort of as a hobby, just to do something outside of work. Initially, one of my friends forwarded me a Tim Ferriss interview with Mark Andreessen, a venture capitalist. And I said, wow, this is so cool. You can listen to a high-level person speak for hours on various topics. And then I started to listen to alternative health shows, which led me to hear more about the nature of consciousness and energy and psychic phenomena and things like that. And the more I heard about those topics and started to read books and scientific papers, I realized, whoa, if even 1% of this is true, I have to rethink my very existence. And yeah, that's putting it mildly, because I was,
Yeah.
who am I? What am I doing here? Everything I used to believe was true might not be. And most of the people in my family and personal and professional networks are not even thinking about this stuff. What's going on? Because at the time, I didn't know there were huge communities of people that were already familiar with this. And basically, since then, I've been on a nonstop journey to rethink all of my paradigms, not just the nature of consciousness, which is where I started, but moving into politics, medicine, cosmology, much more. It led me to leave my firm. Actually, I left right before everything happened with COVID and late 2019, early 2020. And this was after I had become a partner at the firm. After spending about a decade there, I made it to where I wanted to be. And I was in a great position in my early 30s, career-wise, but I just felt like I was being energetically torn in two very different directions. And while I was at work doing very serious client stuff, it was too hard to basically shut out this other energy that was very curious and wanted to explore the nature of reality. So I made probably the hardest decision of my life so far, which was to say, I'm going to leave the firm. I had to tell my business partners, and I was in like I said, a great spot, really interesting work, that I was going to leave the firm and actually not go to another job. I was just going to leave to give myself space. And since leaving, I'd only written one book at the time. I've written 6 more books. And the 7th one recently just came out on cosmology.
That's a beautiful story. And it reminds me of something Joseph Campbell says. You may have heard it. He said, most people spend their entire life climbing the ladder of success only to get to the top and realize it's leaning against the wrong wall.
Exactly right. I lived it.
I wish I would have known you around that time, because I would have been happy to share some perspectives on some of these very interesting things, which I gave you a little peek at with Spirit Gym. But these are things I've been investigating my whole life. And you mentioned the 2008 stock market crash. I'll never forget that, because, boy, that took my business, our business, right to its knees. We went from quite a large staff all the way down to 4 employees, and we're barely making it. If it wasn't for the fact that I had filmed and produced so many videos and could survive with correspondence course sales, we might not exist today. But boy, I'll tell you what, I had to work my ass off. I think we ended up $750,000 in debt through that 2008 crash. And it took me 2 years of intensive work and doubling my travel schedule to climb out of the hole. I think that is a little marker of memory, like COVID, that a lot of people will never forget.
Yes, certainly I won't forget it myself.
Well, when we met to prep for the podcast, we agreed that a great approach would be to dive into a little exploration of each of your books and explore them in the order that you wrote them. An End to Upside Down Thinking is I think the first one I read is An End to Upside Down Thinking, Dispelling the Myth that the Brain Produces Consciousness and the Implications for Everyday Life, An End to the Upside Down. That's a topic that I have studied very, very deeply myself. So I'd love it to begin with, if we just dive into sort of what your key observations and thoughts and feelings, and maybe some of the conclusions you've come to from your own research. And along the way, if I have some thoughts to share, I'll wait for a good time to dialogue with you on whatever rises.
Sounds good. And I want to preface this discussion, Paul, by saying when I wrote this first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, I didn't realize I would write other books. I was still working at my firm. I wasn't a partner yet. I was just I thought the subject was so important that I wanted to write a book about it.
Yeah, good.
And little did I know I would write more. I think my publisher, however, sadly, he passed away. His name is Bill Gladstone from Waterside Productions. He came up with the title of the book. Because I sent a full manuscript. He said, I love it, but the title needs to be An End to Upside Down Thinking. He knew that there was something about this upside down that could be continued, and it has. But what I talk about in this first book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, flows into everything else I do, because it gets to the basic nature of reality. Is the nature of reality as science teaches us, or the way I used to think it was, which is that it's fundamentally material, where, as we're told, there was a big bang 13.8 billion years ago, filling the universe with these bits of matter, which started to interact with each other. They bump into each other, and you end up with these random chemical reactions, which over time randomly produce a self-replicating molecule like DNA, RNA, that leads to the development of biological organisms like a human being. And then magically consciousness pops out of the brain of these organisms. That is the view that I used to have. And if you believe that view, that consciousness is something that just pops out of the brain of a biological organism, then when the brain dies, that means that's the end of your consciousness. It also implies that consciousness is something that is stuck inside of our skull in the present moment, certainly cannot transcend space and time. So this would seemingly rule out things like psychic phenomena and the survival of consciousness after the body dies. All of that is what I challenge in this book.
What are some of the key things that, as you did your research that were pivotal observations or realizations for you? And how did you go ahead from that point within yourself to get enough evidence to change your viewpoint, not from an intellectual perspective, but maybe from a heartfelt perspective, to where you actually changed your personal myth?
Yeah, well, that's a very observant question because it was not an overnight shift. I learned of certain phenomena and arguments that were compelling at first, but it took a while to feel embodied in that, to the point where, as a working professional in Silicon Valley, that I could write a book about something so crazy. So let me start with one of the things that made me comfortable, which is that there are some unknowns in neuroscience and philosophy that I felt like serve as an important starting point that I could start with anyone to have a conversation. And it's really around the hard problem of consciousness. This is the idea that neuroscientists and philosophers alike do not understand how something immaterial like consciousness, so consciousness is basically our experiencing, our capacity for experience, our subjective inner awareness. It's hard to describe because it's not physical. I can't touch it. I can't point to it. I have to use language, which is always going to be some kind of distortion. But in any event, we all have consciousness right now because we're having experience. So we know we have it, and we know the brain is somehow related to it because there are correlations that we know in neuroscience, where if someone gets injured in a car accident, damages a certain part of the brain, let's say a part of the brain responsible for vision, we can say, look, this part of the brain changed and your vision changed. So we know there's a correlation. But what scientists are unable to do is jump to causation, to say, is the brain creating consciousness in this process, or is there some other explanation? An alternative explanation, and this is not what mainstream neuroscientists believe, is that the brain is like an interface for consciousness, meaning consciousness exists well beyond the body, and the brain somehow filters it, interfaces with it, receives, transmits, and perhaps other parts of the body do as well. So our biology is basically an embodiment of consciousness rather than the producer. And that's the argument that I make in the book for the following reasons. So that's the kind of the philosophical underpinning, which is that talk to any neuroscientist, they don't understand consciousness, and therefore we have to be open to these other things. And then we get to the pieces of scientific evidence that when I first studied them, I didn't realize they were all related to this question of brain and consciousness. When I first encountered them, these were just basically what some would call paranormal phenomena. And I don't really like that term because it presumes that we know what normal is. If we have a materialist perspective of reality, all the things I'm going to describe now are anomalies that are totally paranormal. But if we have a different view of reality that puts consciousness at the center, these things are all very much expected. And the analogy that I'll use before I get into the anomalies that really helped me, it comes from a philosopher, Dr. Bernardo Kastrup.
Oh yeah, I've studied him. I'm trying to get him on the podcast.
So he describes a philosophy known as analytic idealism, which is in contrast to materialism that I described before, where everything's material. He would say that everything is mind, everything is consciousness. And the analogy that really helped me is to think of all reality as being like an infinite stream of water, where water is like consciousness, and each of us as an individual person is like a whirlpool within the stream. So we are an individual on one level, and we're interconnected as something bigger on another level, which is paradoxical. But if you adopt this basic analogy, and I call it an analogy, and so does he, because reality is probably so much more complex than this, but we have to start somewhere. Especially for me, when I was shifting my paradigm, this was, okay, I could picture this. But if you imagine some of the water from my whirlpool getting into your whirlpool, the analogy there is some of my consciousness getting into your consciousness. That would mean this model says psychic phenomena are predicted. They're not paranormal. So that's point one. Point two is if you imagine the whirlpool basically dissolving back into the broader stream, delocalizing. That's sort of like when the physical body dies, our consciousness doesn't leave the stream, so to speak. Rather, it transitions into a new form, and maybe it could even reconfigure into a new whirlpool, and that would be akin to reincarnation. So all these phenomena that used to be paranormal for me, they weren't. And then the question becomes, is there any evidence for this? And I'll just give a few bullet points, because what I do in the book is I go through chapter after chapter, one on each phenomenon. So a full chapter on telepathic communications, a full chapter on remote viewing. This was a powerful one for me. Remote viewing is the ability to perceive something with the mind alone that's far away both in space and time. And I was able to pull up, like anyone can, declassified CIA documents that describe the US government's activities, where they say, and this is a direct quote, that remote viewing is a real phenomenon. Implications are revolutionary. There are declassified programs. I actually interviewed Russell Targ for my podcast series, Where is My Mind? He was a laser physicist who led the program for the US government and dealt directly with these remote viewers. There are also peer-reviewed papers on these topics. One that I would recommend is by Dr. Edsel Cardenia from Lund University in Sweden. He compiles the statistical evidence in controlled studies for various psychic phenomena in American Psychologist, which is the official peer-reviewed academic journal of the American Psychological Association. So when I saw that, because there are many decades of studies, I said, whoa, they allowed this study to go through. And this is on telepathy, which is mind-to-mind communication, also mind-matter interaction, which is psychokinesis. And one more thing I'll give just as a brief overview. The 2016 president of the American Statistical Association, her name is Dr. Jessica Utz. So hardcore statistician. She wrote, using the standards applied to any other area of science, it is concluded that psychic functioning has been well established. That was her conclusion. To me, these were very powerful anecdotes. And I'll pause there, Paul, before going on to near-death experiences and other things.
It's interesting you mentioned remote viewing. I guess I never shared with you that I am a remote viewer. In the year 2000, have you ever heard of the Field Conference by she puts it on, Lynn McTaggart?
Yes.
Well, in 2000, I believe Edgar Mitchell was the keynote speaker. And that year, they offered a one-day course in remote viewing with the CIA's then director of remote viewing. And I had been having out-of-body experiences starting when I was 12 years old. Long story made short, I first thought I was maybe going crazy because I was under tremendous stress at the time. So I started going out at night, remote viewing around our property. My parents' farm's 142 acres, so there's quite a lot of space there. And I would go out and find things. Then I would get up in the morning and go check to see if they were there, and they were there every time. So I didn't really realize that what I was doing would best fit in the category of remote viewing. So when this brochure came out for this contest, I thought, I've got to see if I can do whatever they call remote viewing, because I already know based on the descriptions of remote viewing that I can do it. So at the end of the day, they had a contest. There was 750 people in the class, and I won the contest. I have actually been asked to help find on 2 different occasions people that were lost that the National Guard and families couldn't find, and found them both times. One of the things that I wrote, I was writing some notes while you were talking. I wrote remote viewing, and as a remote viewer with a lot of experience, when I began studying consciousness myself, having had a lot of remote viewing experience, when I look at David Chalmers' description of the hard problem and all the literature, the first thought that rose up in my mind is that there's no possible way the brain can be the source of consciousness, or there would be no way for me to go walk on the sun or the moon or anywhere I want to go. It would be impossible to do, because to get to the sun moving at the speed of light takes 8 minutes, and I can get there as quick as I can put my consciousness and focus on that. And so I knew from my own experience that what each of us are has to be a non-local reality and a local manifestation. And so as I meditated on that, if a simple way to think of it is just like you use the stream analogy, but in Spirit Gym, what I share is if God is unconditional love, which most religions would agree upon, then the only symbol you can use for that which is unconditional is 0. Because 0 is simultaneously everything and no thing. And Blaise Pascal had a definition for God, which has also been cited by many other people, including Joseph Campbell, and slightly modified. And it goes like this. You may have heard it. God is a sphere whose circumference is nowhere, and a center whose presence is everywhere. Well, that would be exactly the case with 0, because 0 is a symbol for something that simultaneously isn't, but is the beginning of anything that wants to manifest. So if you think of any graph, any scientific graph, you have a 0 reference line, or an electroencephalogram or electrocardiogram, and a positive wave goes above, a negative wave goes below it. So if the basis of consciousness, what I call big C, is actually the 0 reference point, which may be the 0 point field actually, thinking of the C of consciousness, then all I've got to do to go to anywhere in the manifest reality, which would be any phenomenon or wave phenomenon, something that's moving, like matter is still moving just under the speed of light, all I have to do is direct my consciousness there, hold that empty space inside of myself, which means I would basically go to the 0 reference line, and by directing my intention, my consciousness manifests at the target. So because you can move at the speed of now on the zero reference line. All you got to do is hold the intention to be there. So through lots of inner work and experimentation and studying the literature, the thing that came up for me is that most of the people that are writing on consciousness don't do any inner work. They don't have a spiritual practice. Most of them have never tried 5-MeO DMT or had a good mushroom journey or any of these types of things that really have a very powerful capacity to expand consciousness.
If you have listened to even one episode of Paul's podcast before, then you will know that he is passionate, and some would say even fanatical, about the quality of the food he eats and where it is sourced from. That is why the Chek household only eats pasture-raised meat, wild-caught fish, and organic produce. And that is why we subscribe to Wild Pastures meat delivery service. Each month, Wild Pastures delivers a box of meat that has been raised by family farmers in the USA using regenerative farming practices. 100% grass-fed and finished beef, pasture-raised chicken, and pasture-raised pork, as well as wild-caught seafood. You can customize the selection in your box, add on extra when you know you will be feeding more people, or change your options each and every month. You might be thinking that this will be too expensive for you, but Wild Pasture's mission is to offer the highest quality meat at the lowest prices because they want to transform the meat industry. And that means that more people need to be able to choose meat that is raised right. Their pasture-raised animals are part of a natural ecosystem. Their farmers use rotational grazing, practices that mimic nature, and so do not need to use synthetic fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides, hormones, or antibiotics. This beautiful process doesn't require the external resources, such as massive amounts of GMO grain, required with environmentally depleting conventional methods. And best of all, the meat and fish taste amazing. And for Paul's listeners, Wild Pastures are offering you 20% off your subscription for life, $15 off your first order, and free shipping. Seriously, you can't find a better deal for top quality pasture-raised meat. Go to wildpastures.com/Paul Chek. You don't need a promo code. Just visit wildpastures.com/Paul Chek and start choosing the goodies you will have delivered to you in your first box.
Another issue with the hard problem, I've been studying alchemy for very, very long time, and I've developed my own system of alchemy, which I teach the basics of in Spirit Gym. But one of the fundamental principles of alchemy basically says that the entire created universe is based out of the elements earth, water, fire, and air. But what the left-brainers don't realize is they're not actually only talking about the physical substances. Each of those is a name for a range of vibration or range of frequency. But in alchemy, fire and air are volatile elements, which means they can move things. And earth and water are passive elements or non-volatile. So to think that the brain is producing consciousness, to give as analogy to my students, I asked them, how long would you have to stand next to a pile of rocks before a toaster oven or a Rolex watch jumped out? Forever. Therefore, if we look at the concept of alchemy, that the fire element, which is the highest vibration, represents the dimension of spirit, which is the dimension of dreaming or God's desire to experience itself. And then we step down to the air element, which is the dimension of mind. And we all know mind is volitional. To raise your arm, you got to think the thought, raise your arm. If you want to build a house, you have to have the thought, build the house. The water element is a dimension of emotions and feeling. And in metaphysics, it would be the astral dimension, which Steiner says is also the animating dimension. And it's what allows us to feel our thoughts. And then we have the earth element. So from the alchemist's perspective, it is the fire and the air elements that actually form and move the earth and water elements. And therefore, when we look at how the brain works, the brain's really, and many people, as you know, talk about this, the brain's really more like Aldous Huxley called it a reducing valve. Itzhak Bentov and many others, Fred Alan Wolfe and many others have referred to it more like a two-way radio, but it's actually a filter for consciousness. And the ego structure acts as the filtration system. Otherwise, we'd be totally overwhelmed because everything would be happening all at once. So a couple of other points I wanted to bring up, Mark, I think you might find interesting. You may or may not be aware of these. Are you familiar with Karl Pribram's studies that he did by cutting chunks of brain out of mice and putting them in a maze?
I am familiar with those studies. I read about them in the holographic universe.
Yes, with
Yes.
isn't that David Talbot?
Yes.
Yes, I've studied that book. It's a very good book. Well, for the listeners, what Pribram did was he wanted to see if consciousness was in the brain. So he took mice, opened their skull up. First, he taught them how to run through a maze and they memorized the maze, but then he began removing chunks of their brain and he kept taking chunks of the brain out until he got to the last chunk and there was no more brain. And finally, the mice couldn't figure out their way through the maze. And as soon as he put even one little piece of brain in, they could figure their way out through the maze. So he said, well, wait a minute, the memory for the maze can't be in the brain. So that certainly, made people think a lot. But there's another thing, Mark, that you probably would be aware of, but I think since we're on the topic, I've seen now at least a dozen cases of hydrocephalus where there is nothing there. There is some as low as 5% of the brain, some just the brain stem. And in one case, there's a guy with hydrocephalus that had an IQ of 125. Now, how do the materialists explain an IQ of 125 when there's technically nothing but water in somebody's skull, right? So this creates a lot of problems. These are some of the things that I think are very important. A couple of things too I'd like to share that I think might be interesting to you and the listeners. The definitions for consciousness vary quite a bit, but have you ever studied any of Itzhak Bentov's work?
Only a little bit.
His book, Stalking the Wild Pendulum, I think you'd be mind blown. It's just a beautiful book. But Bentov says consciousness is the total flow of information within any system. He doesn't isolate information to the system. He just says it's the total flow of information. Another point of view is Edward Edinger, MD, who is a psychiatrist and a Jungian analyst and wrote several excellent books. Edinger defines consciousness as a psychic substance produced not blindly, but in living awareness of opposites. So he actually is making the statement that consciousness is a psychic substance. It's something that's tangibly real, and that it is not produced blindly, but in living awareness of opposites, meaning you can't have consciousness, you can't make meaning out of something without north and south, male or female, inside, outside. So in Edinger's view, consciousness depends on complementary opposites, which is exactly what the Tai Chi symbol symbolizes. And Annika Harris, Sam Harris's wife, wrote a book on consciousness, and she said basically consciousness exists if it's something that it's like to be something. So if you could put your mind into, say, a grasshopper and have the grasshopper experience, and I could say to you, Mark, what's it like to be a grasshopper? If you could actually tell me what it's like to be a grasshopper, that would indicate that the grasshopper was conscious, or you wouldn't have known what it was like to be a grasshopper. So these are some of the interesting things. And I have a lot on consciousness and spirit, Jim, and it goes quite a lot deeper than what I've just shared. But these are some interesting things. And I remember reading your book and really because I'd researched all this stuff. One, I realized you'd read a lot of the same papers and books that I had, but I thought, okay, Mark's marching right down the right line. And I was just excited because I knew whoever read the book would actually be reading things that they really need to consider. Because if you don't consider these things, then you're either trapped in a belief system or you're potentially dangerously ignorant.
And these are fundamental issues. They get to who and what we are and the nature of reality. So that's why I said, even though I was still working at my firm in Silicon Valley, I have to write this book. And I'm going to make it a scientific book and give people the resources to look up more on their own. But before we leave this topic, Paul, I want to just follow up on a few things you said. First, you mentioned Dr. Edgar Mitchell. So I've been on the board of his Institute of Noetic Sciences since 2019. I actually never met him. He passed away before I joined the board. But this notion of hydrocephalus, it speaks to a broader issue that many have referred to, which is that there are quote unquote anomalies where there seems to be less brain or brain functioning, and yet there's an enriched consciousness. It's sort of the reverse of what materialism would predict if the brain is exclusively produced by consciousness. And one of my favorite phenomena in this line of thinking is the near-death experience. And in the book, An End to Upside Down Thinking, there's a whole chapter on it. I think I mentioned it in every book because these are instances where people have little or no brain functioning. Let's say they're in cardiac arrest or some kind of major trauma to the body, and yet they experience a reality that is realer than real. So they've got less brain and then their consciousness is expanded. Dr. Bruce Grayson from the University of Virginia, who I also interviewed for my podcast series, Where is My Mind? He told me we're left with this paradox that at a time when the brain isn't functioning, the mind is functioning better than ever, which is quite profound. The idea is that the brain's actually somehow restricting. It's this reducing valve to a broader reality, which many have experienced, whether it's through psychedelics, and that has not been my path. My path has been more academic, but from many types of mystical experiences, whether it's meditation or other things, people are describing a similar kind of reality where the brain seems to be out of the way a bit. That's one of the patterns that some people have pointed to. But going back to the near-death experience, one of the most profound things, I'll mention two things that have been very profound. One is known as the veridical out-of-body experience. And veridical refers to a verified memory. So let's say a person is in cardiac arrest, and after being resuscitated, the person says, my consciousness was hovering over my body. I saw the entire resuscitation happen in the hospital room. I heard what was happening down the hall. And the doctor says, well, that doesn't make any sense. That's not possible. But you are giving me accurate descriptions. And we know what your brain was doing at the time because they have timestamps for what those memories were. And whoa, that doesn't make any sense. But these are very powerful memories because they are by definition not hallucinations if the memory is verified. And there's an important book called The Self Does Not Die, which has accumulated over 100 of these cases, which are very difficult to document, especially when you're just trying to save someone. You're not necessarily thinking about a near-death experience that you're trying to document, but they have documented verified memories at a time when the brain should not have been capable of producing such memories, let alone memories from a vantage point outside the body. So that's point number one, which points to the potential reality of this other realm of consciousness that's expanded. The second major finding that has really impacted me, it's called the life review phenomenon, which is reported in, let's say, 20 to 30% of near-death experiences, especially in the West. Dr. Gregory Shushan has studied cross-cultural NDEs, and in indigenous cultures, he does not see it, but he does see the theme of the soul being judged, or at least observed by an outside entity. So the theme does appear all over the place. But in the more traditional Western near-death experiences, people talk about a life review where during the near-death experience, so they're clinically dead sometimes, but their consciousness is reliving their whole life. But it's not just from their own perspective, it's from the perspective of the people that they impacted. So they literally become other people and get to feel what it was like, both on the positive and the negative side. So in my podcast series, I interviewed Dannion Brinkley, who's had multiple near-death experiences. And he told me that he had to relive his combat days in Vietnam where he killed people. He became the people that he killed in combat and felt the pain. And it was very difficult for him to describe it to me because it was so painful. He also told me that he felt the pain of the children of the people that he had killed in combat. He felt their pain because they no longer had a father. So he felt the indirect effects, even though they were not quite as strong. So later in life, he had other near-death experiences, which he didn't know he was going to have after his first one when he was basically electrocuted. The other ones, he had open heart surgery twice and brain surgery once. He had life reviews in those near-death experiences, but because his first near-death experience changed him so much, he actually changed his life. He became a hospice volunteer. So in his later near-death experience life reviews, he got to be the person dying in the hospice bed, and he got to see what it was like to be comforted by himself. So he saw the positives and the negatives of what he had done. And there's this notion of a golden rule that seems to be built into the fabric of reality as a sort of natural law. That's what Dr. Bruce Grayson from UVA describes it as in his book, After. So this is a UVA professor saying, look, I've studied these life reviews, and this is beyond morality. It's natural law that there's something about our interconnectedness and the notion, like you said, Paul, of love, that the broader consciousness is made of love. It's actually innate quality that we see from the near-death experiences. And this still is, and especially was 8 years ago, completely game-changing for a person who thought there was nothing beyond this life.
Yes, these things are all things I've studied very deeply. One thing you didn't mention is Ian Stevenson's 2,500 cases of reincarnation. And I've studied a lot of that work. And there's even a couple of great documentaries where he shows exquisitely how people remembered their past lives, times, dates, things like military. One of them was a pilot in the military and knew the tail number on his airplane and the names of the people that he worked with, and they were able to backtrack every bit of it. A lot of these people had birthmarks and remembered how they got the wounds and where they got them, and they were able to track back the histories, and sure enough, that's how they died in wars and various things. I wrote a note down. There's something I want to share with you. I don't think I've mentioned to you that I have 2 wives, but my other wife, Angie, is a shaman and a very skilled shaman. And her and I both do a lot of work helping people who are suffering grief from people dying. And quite often when I'm doing healing work, the deceased loved ones of people will show up at the ceremony and communicate things to me. And this has happened many, many times. And so I'm very familiar, and I speak to my own family members on the other side, and I speak to people like Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner and many others, Osho, whoever I want to talk to that's on the other side, I just go ask them questions. And I've also had a number of near-death experiences myself, and I've done extremely deep plant medicine ceremonies where I went completely, utterly into non-being and don't even know how I got back. And I've had some profound experiences with what I would call God, or the underlying consciousness of all. But one of the things I want to share, because I've done a lot of work with people that have passed over and gone to help them transition, there's a number of cases where people, especially Christians, won't transition through the astral dimension into what is typically seen in NDEs as the light of God. And they're often drawn toward it. And when they move toward the light, then they are taken up into another dimension where they often meet family members and things like that. And then they go into their afterlife experience. Also, there's many people that do not have a life review. I've encountered that several times in deep medicine journeys where I was in so deep that I didn't know if I was ever going to make it back. There's been times where I did have a life review. There's been times that I didn't. But the key point I want to point out here is that what I found from working with all these people, and my wife Angie has also found this, and I did a podcast with a famous medium named Sally Crow. For those of you that hasn't listened to that, I think it's called Death and Beyond with Angie, Chek, and Sally Crow. And we all found the same thing, and that is that the experience a person has when they die is very, very based on the culture they were raised in and any belief system such as religion they had. If you read the book Streams of Wisdom by Dustin DiPerna, which is a comprehensive exploration of consciousness, the structure stages, and how it evolves, he makes a very important statement. He says, no Christian ever sees Buddha during an enlightenment experience. And what he's saying is that someone who's culturally programmed with Christian ideology does not have a frame of reference or an attractor factor for the presence of, or the consciousness of, or the being we would call Buddha, or any other being. They will only find themselves in alignment with, and they're in the experience of seeing Christ, if any Christian. Yet Buddhists will have the experience of meeting Buddha, not Christ. And so I found this over and over again. And then if you read the different books, such as the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and other scriptural writings, there's similarities, but there's differences in them. And if it was all the same experience, then these books would be saying exactly the same thing, and they don't.
January is here. Can you believe it? How are you doing with your New Year's resolutions? If you're like most people, me included, you start the year with great goals to exercise more, eat better, get to bed earlier, start a work-in practice or meditate daily, study some personal improvement book or course regularly, and just become a healthier, happier, more evolved human being. But if you're also like most people, within a few short weeks, life gets in the way and all those good intentions slip away and just seem too hard to accomplish. This is why you need a community to support you and a coach to guide and encourage you. And now you can get both of those when you join the Spirit Gym community. In fact, research shows that people have a 65% chance of reaching a goal if they have an accountability partner. And you can get the support of an entire community of accountability partners when you join Spirit Gym. Now through January 15th, Spirit Gym has special incentives, discounts, and a brand new level of membership to help you make 2025 a standout year. This is the best time for you to join and turn confusion into clarity, uncertainty into purpose, and unfulfillment into true freedom. Go to myspiritgym.com today to get the full details. Whether you opt for the full membership with access to Paul's Master Key online course plus the community, or you decide to join just the community with access to the weekly calls with Paul and his select guests, which are called Sanghas in Spirit Gym, there is a membership option that is right for you. So visit myspiritgym.com and join the growing group of people who are transforming their lives and adopting new freedoms that bring joy, wholeness, and fulfillment.
If God is unconditional love, then the only way God can experience itself is to create conditions within which it can self-reflect. And since God has an infinite capacity to create, infinite creativity, infinite energy, infinite processing speed, infinite processing power, and infinite information, then there has to be an infinite range of possibilities within which God can experience itself. And what I've found is that each of the world religions actually creates a context through which God experiences itself. And each of the 12 constellations of the zodiac really represent archetypes that are like facets. So if you imagine shining white light through a prism, it breaks up into a rainbow. So the analogy that I give is that if you think of God as the undivided light, it passes through the prism of its own desire to experience itself. And in that, we have this diversity of possibilities and diversity of experiences. And many metaphysicians, be it Madame Blavatsky and a long list of them, Steiner included, talk about rays. And they describe how human beings are born in different rays of consciousness, and that we evolve through each of these different rays, which provide different experiences. And what I was shown through my work with all these different beings I've worked with in my studies is that we reincarnate through each of the world's religions, and we reincarnate through each of the 12 constellations of the zodiac until we've been able to experience consciousness as a human from each of these perspectives. And at that time, we have enough awareness of who and what we really are that we're able to transcend out of the need for a physical human body. And we then exist in higher dimensions. And what happens after that's a long story. But I think these are things that are very important for people to understand. And this is one of the reasons that I made Spirit Gym a meta-myth system where it didn't matter what belief. Like when you were an atheist, you could have come into Spirit Gym and I would have shown you how a myth is created and what the function of myth is. And then the real thing I ask people is, now that you understand the principles that life is lived based on, and the golden rule being the foundation, I've said many times, we should get rid of all 900 and something pages of the Bible and just write, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, 1,000 pages, until people actually wake up to that reality. And that's far older than Christianity, that concept as well. So I think these are things that we all need to think about, because what I'm really pointing to here is that your belief system actually becomes like, imagine you have a slide projector. If you don't have a slide in it, all you see on the screen is white light. There's nothing there. But when you drop the Christian idea in, let's say you see Jesus and Christian themes. If you drop the Muslim slide in, you see Allah in that context. The Buddhist slide, the atheist slide. So really, because God can't know itself without some kind of a story to embody the experience, what I've found and what spiritual development really is about is ultimately asking the question, is it really true? Steiner describes that when we reach the point in our spiritual development where we begin to honestly question our beliefs and ask, is it really true? He says that's the point at which the awareness soul is born. And that's when we begin to really go deeper into and question ideas and to see what their limitations are and if they're actually true as far as what they produce as experiences in our life. For example, the belief that God loves you but will burn you in hell for sinning doesn't make any sense and leads a lot of people into a sort of a deep sense of angst, because their rational mind can look at something like that and see that it's sort of a self-negating philosophy where you have two completely opposites juxtaposed against each other that ultimately annihilate you. And what's sad for me, Mark, is having worked with so many people in transition, that have died, but they're still hanging either around the earth plane or in the astral plane, and they're not moving on. The most common thing they tell me is they do. And my brother committed suicide when he was 34. And when I went to talk to him, I found him in the astral dimension, literally just floating in limbo. And I said to him, Scott, why are you not moving into the light to be with God? He said, I hate God. Look at all the pain I had to live through. Look at all the torture and all the beatings and all the abuse I got as a child. If God loves me, then that would have never happened. And I said, so long story, I explained to him at a much deeper level, and I was able to help him understand. And he then realized what was really going on and why his life had been so challenging. And he was able to transition into the light. And it was really quite a shock for me because many years had gone by since he died. And I, in my heart, had just thought that he would transition. But every now and then my grandmother, who's been long gone, will come visit me. And I had a deep, deep loving connection with my grandmother. And one day I just had this urge to check in with my grandmother and my grandfather, who I really loved. And I was talking to my grandmother and I said, Grandma, how's Scott doing? She said, not well. He really needs your help. I said, what do you mean? She said, he won't transition because he hates God. And I said, oh my God. She said, why don't you go talk to him? And so I did. And it was really shocking to me, but it was only shocking because I felt so bad, Mark, because he'd been out there for so many years in limbo. And I've found people out that have been out there for 100+ years or more due to these exact belief systems. And so you see, the point I'm making is that the mind is actually so powerful that whatever you believe, you manifest. And that is the God quality within us. Consciousness wants to experience itself, but because God can't know itself as only positive polarities, it's as committed to the darkness as it is to the light. In other words, these kinds of experiences are experience for God. And because each one of us is a unique expression of the divine, there are no two of us the same. There's no two anything in nature the same, no two grains of sand, no two snowflakes. There will never be another Mark Gober. There will never be another Paul Chek. So each of us is a novel expression of the divine, from the microorganisms all the way to the angels. And so each one of us is given this opportunity to allow God to experience that potential of itself. And no matter what we do, paradoxically, Adolf Hitler is loved as much by God and Bill Gates as Buddha and Jesus would be loved by God. And that's something that a lot of people have a really hard time wrapping themselves around. But the reality of it is God cannot know itself only as the good. And I think one thing I want to share before we move on is I too found all this disturbing about all the evil in the world. And I went deep into meditation and asked my soul to connect me directly to God consciousness. And I said to God, with the amount of intelligence that you have, I mean, if you can create universes and create us and all the things that you create, why does human life have to be so painful? And why do you allow evil? And God said to me, you must understand that the function of evil is to uphold the good. And that right there made a lot of sense. And I was also told that I can't know myself as only one reality. And if there was no evil, then you nor I would have free will. I do not want to be loved inauthentically. Therefore, I give all living beings free will so that they can choose to love God or me once they realize what is the source of creation. And without evil, there would be no free will. And because of evil, you can choose to love or not to love. And ultimately, I was told that love is what makes the differentiation between moral behavior, which is in this case, life affirmative behavior, versus evil, which is life destructive. Moral is concern for others' well-being, not just your own. And evil is concern only for your own personal gain and not that of others. So I'm sharing these things with you just because I have these experiences and I think they're important in the context of everything that we're talking about. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are in that regard.
Yeah, so many profound things you just said, Paul. And it actually flows into the second book I wrote, which is called
Awesome.
An End to Upside Down Living, which is taking the findings from the first book. So let's say all these things are real: psychic phenomena, survival of consciousness beyond bodily death, reincarnation. There's evidence for this stuff. How would you then think about developing a philosophy for living one's life? And actually, the question I ask in that book is, what is the overall orientation of your life? And I seek to answer that question for myself. And in the final chapter, I do, basically developing a compass to orient oneself, because I didn't have a compass before. And now, with the complexity of reality, given all these phenomena of consciousness, I had to rethink everything. One that I want to start with is the notion of evil or pain and suffering, how to contextualize that. And I think where I end up is with basically layers of truth, because at one level of truth, we can look at things that are horrific in the world and call them objectively evil, in that it would be irresponsible to allow people to suffer without at least trying to do something, if we can do something. And at another higher level of reality, I completely agree with you that what we would call evil or pain and suffering is part of a stimulus in some way for much higher reasons than the human mind can often even comprehend. It allows for evolution and growth, and for consciousness to perceive itself by having that contrast
and choice.
And choice. We wouldn't be able to have all of that without the duality of the dark and the light, the good and evil, whatever you want to call it. Where I landed in this book and End to Upside Down Living, and still feel is the most likely truth, is that we are here to evolve through experience. And therefore, our goal is to basically become the best version of ourselves so that we can be of service in our evolution to ourselves and to others. So it's like a two-pronged effect. One is the perfection of one's own self to be the best version of who you are. And by being that truest version of yourself in integrity, one is then able to serve others at the highest degree. So I think both are important, the self-work and then also the service. Ignoring either one can be problematic. And I've seen teachings that will focus on one without the other. And I think they're both essential. And one more thing before I pause, you reminded me of something that I actually wrote about in my book, An End to Upside Down Medicine, when I talk about phenomena of consciousness and how they relate to healing. I talk about demonic possessions, which have been studied.
I've removed many entities from people. I did a very comprehensive podcast with a really skilled shaman named Hamilton Souther on plant medicines and talked about that. But I also did a 7-hour program with Kedrich Olson, who is very skilled at working with entities. It's a whole feature on entities and possession. It's called Are You Possessed? And I'd be happy to give the whole series to you. And Kedrich he's got shows on Gaia TV, highly skilled, the real deal. And him and I both have a lot of experience, as does my wife, Angie, working with possessions and entities. So we did a 7-hour program to explain all the different types of entities versus the types of things that happen inside of us, which I won't go into. It's too long. But I really broke it down so people could realize if they're possessed and if they have symptoms of possession, what other things should they look at? How do you get into that state? How do you heal from it? And at what point do you know you need somebody with skill to do an extraction for you?
Yeah, I've come to the same conclusion that it is a real phenomenon. And in the medicine book, I quote Dr. Gallagher, who's Ivy League trained and has worked with people who have these possession experiences. But in that book, I also quote a Catholic priest who does exorcisms. And he said that he spoke with one of the lower level demons who was possessing someone he was working with. And that demon, to the extent that we can even trust the demons, but in any event, the demon said to him that some of them are sent by God because once the person overcomes the possession, that person reaches a level of sanctification that is very impactful in a positive way to the world more broadly. The person becomes holy in a sense after overcoming something so traumatic. And I think that's a microcosm for what probably many of us are going through in our own challenges. We are becoming purified, sanctified as we go through and work through our challenges.
You know, enzymes are one of the most important things we can use to supplement our diet. Very few people have normal levels of digestive enzymes. It's extremely common to be digestive enzyme deficient because so many people are eating cooked foods, processed foods, packaged foods, etc. The best digestive enzymes I've ever found are Masszymes by Bioptimizers. And one of the things I like about them is not only are they the most advanced technology for how they're produced, the science behind them, but I take them on an empty stomach every morning and every night as proteolytic enzymes to help clean my body. So I've got Wade here, who's the formulator of these enzymes, to tell us how do they work as digestive and proteolytic enzymes, because today I think we really need to be supplementing with high quality enzymes. So Wade, what's unique about Masszymes?
Well, one of the interesting things is undigested protein is one of the biggest contaminants that cause problem for people, whether it's in their blood or inflammatory conditions or even impairing recovery. And it's quite common amongst athletes who have high protein diets, interesting enough, who are looking to add recovery, but they're not breaking down their protein effectively. And that was my case way back in the day as a former bodybuilding champion. So we set about cultivating and developing an enzyme formulation that handled all of the amino acids in a pH range from 2 to 12, as well as providing an assortment of assistant enzymes. In other words, it doesn't just break down protein, it handles carbohydrates, it handles fats, it handles fibers, a variety of different things, and they work synergistically together to make sure that you can break down just about any food and digest it properly. Now, when you talk about the difference between enzymes, there's digestive enzymes and systemic enzymes. Systemic enzymes such as like nattokinase or serrapeptase. Well, they don't help break down digestion, but they can break down inflammation or inflammatory conditions, undigested proteins, or scarring tissue inside the body. Well, it turns out when you take Masszymes on an empty stomach, it works exactly the same way. It will go into the bloodstream and now works as a systemic enzyme, reducing inflammation, accelerating recovery times. Matt just tore his Achilles tendon and made a full recovery after surgery within a few weeks, which they expected for many months. He was taking as many as 100 a day. Now, I'm not suggesting people do that, but this was an extreme condition. And the bottom line is Masszymes is great for recovery, for cleaning up undigested proteins in the system, as well for digesting just about any meal. If this isn't the best digestive enzyme or systemic enzyme that you've ever taken, you get your money back. That's the Bioptimizer guarantee.
You can try Bioptimizer's Masszymes at bioptimizers.com/living4D and get 10% off using the code PAUL10. That's bioptimizers.com/living, the number 4 and the letter D, and the code is PAUL10. Plus, Bioptimizers always have great bonuses and offers when you purchase multiple bottles. So make sure you check them out at bioptimizers.com/living4D and use the promo code PAUL10 for your 10% discount.
Many people have this belief about God that, we can thank the Abrahamic religions for. They're called the religions of the sky god, that God's out there and somehow separate. And of course, when you believe in the devil and that the devil causes all these problems and all the bad shit in the world is from the devil, it creates a fundamental problem. Because if you worship God, but you're afraid of the devil and you believe that God is only good, it means that something else had to have created the devil, which puts you in the predicament of having two gods. And then you're stuck with who created those two gods. So it creates an unsolvable dichotomy, really. Like you're in a bind that you can't get out of there unless you go deeper, which is why I spent so much time researching all this spiritually and through the literature. But if we look at the Bible, it describes God with the prefix omni, which, as you know, means all. So omniscient means all-knowing. Omnipresent means all-present. Omnipotent means all-powerful, etc. But what I've found through my own research and deep discussions with my own soul and my highest self, which are really expressions of the same thing, is this is what I was taught. God is omni in all senses of the word. To be omniscient, all-knowing, only means that God has the potential and has, shall we say, an infinite pool of possibilities. But to know something is not to experience something. And you cannot actually create wisdom until you go through an experience and have the phenomenon we call trial and error. Like, how many of us think we know somebody when we get married to them and we're deep in love, but a year later we're fighting like cats and dogs and wondering why the hell we got married to this person? Because what we had was this love-drunk sense of knowing, omniscience, but we did not have the experience and the time in relationship to find out what biases we carry, what wounds that are unhealed we carry. And this is why growth in relationship is the work of love is real work, right? It's really the work of spiritual growth. So it is through life itself that God, in its perfection, tests its own omniscience against the experience that it gains through life. And it is through, I tell my students that we are all Ram Dass, Ram, God, Das, worker. We are all agents of God going through the process of living out the potential as Mark Gober or Paul Chek or any one of us. But within that, we're all given these unique opportunities within the framework of the experience of life, time, culture, place, relationship. And it is through our experience and all the sentient beings, which are potentially infinite throughout the universe, which we'll get into in your upcoming book, that God is actually having the experience of testing its own omniscience, which we will call perfection, against the reality of experience. And many people think that God is perfect. And I say, yes, but for something to be perfect, you have to have something to measure that against. You see, if you told me, Paul, I just made the perfect baseball bat, if we didn't have other baseball bats to compare it to, we could never determine if it was perfect or not. And the other fundamental problem is that perfection does not move. It cannot be perfected. And this is why in Buddhism, they have a concept, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, called Duhkha. Are you familiar with that term?
No.
Dukkha. It means necessary imbalance. In actual translation, it means wobbly wheel. Fred Alan Wolfe talks about it in his excellent book, The Spiritual Universe, which I think if you haven't read, it would blow your mind. It's excellent. But what it talks about from the Buddhist perspective is that there is this necessary imbalance built into everything in the universe without which there would be no movement. So this necessary imbalance is, for example, how many movie stars, rock stars, and billionaires have everything they could ever want, but they still feel empty inside? How many of them have committed suicide? Because there's this necessary imbalance in us without which we wouldn't keep striving. And ultimately, what I've found is that because only God can create a soul and the nature of the soul itself is unconditional love, the soul cannot ultimately be satiated by anything but what it is, which is God. And so that's why all souls eventually emerge out of a materialistic reality and begin to find some form of desire to experience and understand what created them. And we call that container religion typically. And then each of the religions have not only their fundamentalist branches, but they have their mystical branches, such as the Sufis is mystical Islam. We have mystical Christianity, mystical Judaism, which is where we get the Kabbalah. So when people come to me as patients and they're really trapped on these fundamentalist ideas, and I can see it's directly related to the challenges they're having with their health, their relationships, and their life, I don't try to change their beliefs by teaching them another religion or quantum physics or deep psychology. I introduce them to the mystics of their own religion. And lo and behold, the very people that grew out of that fundamentalist ideology are now speaking truths that are the same things that quantum physicists are saying, that are identical to the things that other mystics are saying, no matter what religion they came from. And I found when they actually realize what the mystics of their own religion, which are pretty much always the most enlightened in any religion, are telling them, they all of a sudden wake up to something much greater than words written on paper and memorized. And so in summary, what I'm saying is God's perfection has to be tested against something, and what it's tested against is life. And God's omniscience cannot be verified until it's tested against life. And the outcome of making mistakes and living through the process of experiencing life produces the essence of wisdom. And what I believe is that when the soul leaves the body, it can't take money with it. It can't take belongings with it. It can only take what it's become. And so in alchemy, what they call the stone, which is ultimately the synthesis of our life's wisdom, is what the soul carries with it through each lifetime as it evolves. And ultimately, we reach the place where we become wise enough and loving enough that we can choose nirvana, which means to blow out or to extinguish, at which time the drop returns to the ocean. And Rumi says something very profound. Rumi says, to get to God, you must become a heretic. And what he's saying is you cannot get to God by reading books and memorizing things. only when you start going against beliefs and ideologies and take the real spiritual journey into having your own relationship with God, and you begin to become open enough to start having legitimate numinous experiences that are so powerful they change your orientation, such as a near-death experience, a samadhi. Then you have your own relationship with God, and you realize how much of what you once believed and maybe even have killed people for is not true, but it's necessary because it builds the muscles of the mind to create a framework of self-reflection without which we would have no identity, and therefore we would have nothing to contain the experience when we merge into oneness experiences such as samadhis, etc., with God. And, you could say children are born in that open state of oneness with God and oneness with everything. Steiner says you can tell when a child's ego is developing because it begins to use the word I and no. And that is the point, usually around 2 years of age, which for the first time it's differentiating itself from the couch, the floor, the dog, mom, dad, and everything else. So we're kind of born in the God consciousness state, but we have to build a mind in order to have a sense of context for the life experience we're going to have. But spiritual development is actually learning to go beyond the mind. And Steiner says, when you ask, is it really true? That's when you're actually doing what Rumi says, you're becoming a heretic. And then you have to develop the spiritual courage to stand against the masses that are conditioned and don't really have any free will yet because they're just acting out a belief system.
Well, I want to speak about the notion of heretic because that rings true for me in my journey, where with each new paradigm that I explore and then eventually write about, I have to think twice about it because I say, first of all, I know there are people who strongly disagree with what I'm about to say, who might have agreed with me before, and I will alienate those people. And I have to go with what I think is right versus what other people think of me. So I've definitely experienced that and continue to. And it also relates to changing belief systems, like you were saying, where there are aspects of what I might have said a few years ago that I don't fully agree with anymore. And I have to be okay with the fact that I disagree with myself or that I think I was wrong publicly in some
It's
way.
called growing up.
It's natural, but it's painful.
Yeah, it can be.
It can be. And that's part of my perfectionistic journey, I guess, of wanting to win and get it right. But it's part of my learning process. And I do think for all of us in some way, we go through this in our evolutionary journey. And you also are reminding me of a phenomenon I discuss in N2 Upside Down Living, the notion of between lives periods. So you mentioned Dr. Ian Stevenson's work at the University of Virginia, over 2,500 cases who have past life memories that have sometimes been validated by historical records. Dr. Jim Tucker has continued that work at UVA. But in a number of the cases where the children have past life memories, they also describe what are known as intermission memories. So a period after they died in one life and before the current life, where they even speak about choosing parents.
Mm-hmm.
And some adults remember these as well, sometimes
Yes.
spontaneously,
I
sometimes.
remember.
You do? Okay.
Yep.
I do not myself, but I've come across enough cases. And the theme in that is that when we come into a new life, there are elements of choice, even though the life is not fixed, but there are certain things that are likely to happen that will result in specific challenges that as we overcome them or even confront them will result in our own growth and evolution. And if you want to call it getting closer to the realization of God in that process. And that for me still is and was just such a profound thing because it speaks to the idea that we have amnesia to some degree. And maybe in some cases, like in your case, Paul, you remember between lives areas. I don't, and I know many people who don't as well. So there's a wiping of the memory that I guess allows us to start fresh and take the test without having the answers, so to speak, which gives us a true challenge. And on one level, that could sound masochistic. And on another level, it sounds like a challenge that can help us grow. I mean, I think back to my tennis days where the harder I trained, it was painful, physically painful, but I'd be much better in the matches when I trained really well. I was much stronger. I was much more nuanced with my strategy. I was on point, but it took pain very often to get to that level. So I do see this paradox in some ways that suffering can lead to our spiritual evolution.
It does. And I'd like to share a perspective on that. But first, I'd like to tell you that the way I realized that I had chosen the path that I was taking in life didn't come till I was probably 55. I study a lot of spiritual teachers, and in one of Arnold Mendel's book, it might be The Mind of God. I can't remember because I've read all of his books, but he gives exercises in there that you can do. They're meditations you can enter into, which I've practiced a lot of these things, but it was specifically to hold the intention of asking, where were you before you came into the womb? And so I went into this exercise, went into, a deep meditation, and asked my soul to take me to the state. And I saw myself floating in my spirit body, which is a light body, which is what I remote view in. And I remember I distinctly recognized the beach because my mother, as a young woman, was raised in Los Angeles, and my father's home's only a few miles from the beach at Marina del Rey. And I saw myself in this vision sitting on a rock on top of a bit of a cliff, like maybe a 20-foot embankment. And I saw my mother as a young woman. I was born when she was only 16, but I saw her walking along the beach, and I could see that she was very sad and very alone. And she was going through a lot of trauma because she got pregnant with me early, and my father disowned her, called her a tramp and a lot of other words, and basically kicked her out of the house. And the year before that, her mother had died, and the year before that, her sister had died. So she was extremely alone. And I remember seeing her and feeling that she needed my company so bad that I felt that without that, she might die. And so, a long story, but whenever a soul's ready to reincarnate because they finished their afterlife processing, based on their level of development, they can only see the parents, and what they see is the light of the parents that are carrying the right level of consciousness and have the right, shall we say, environment for that soul to evolve in. And whenever two people start making love, light is produced that souls in the afterlife can see. And the moment the sperm meets the egg, it sets a flash off, just like a supernova. And I've seen this many times because I can see souls hovering around people that are like in love and having sex. And I've predicted many times that you'd be pregnant soon, and I was right over and over again because I can see it in my third eye. I'm clairvoyant. But I remember having been able to see that my mother at the time was pregnant and that a soul had not entered her. And I saw myself leaving and entering her womb, and then I began my life in her womb. So the point I wanted to bring up is simply that I didn't remember as a child. I only remembered when I went through this spiritual development exercise based on Arnold Mendel's teachings and had a very profound sense of how it was. And it was important for me to have that experience because I'd always questioned how it is that we choose our parents and we choose the time and the culture. And I've done a lot of work on that through spiritual investigation. But basically what I experienced at that time turned out to be parallel to the studies I've done and the explorations that I've done.
It is fascinating because for me, as someone who didn't consider previously memories before the womb, it actually made me just think about the mind in a new way. Because if I really think hard about it, I don't even remember a first memory. It just sort of fades into existence, which does align with this idea that maybe there was something before that's just fuzzy, that we need to perhaps enter these altered states to re-access.
What I've found through my experience and my investigations, and this is what I was taught, but I've also found other teachers and gurus that say this, and Yogananda, my mother became a yogi when I was 12, so I spent a lot of time in the Self-Realization Fellowship, and I went to summer camp with the monks when I was 15, so I began meditating regularly when I was 12 years old, so I was able to learn to get my mind still enough to make some of these important communications. But what I found, and I had a lot of long conversations with my soul and said, why is it that people can't remember their past lives? And my soul said, we all drink from the river of forgetfulness. And the reason is because most of us have done such horrific things in our past lives when we were less conscious people, or when we had to take more of a negative path to get experience of the darkness and to learn what we don't want to do to other people as we become more and more love-centered and love-oriented or God-conscious. And that if people were born and had access to their past lives, they would have so much guilt and shame that it would immobilize them, and they would never be able to get over the pain of it. And my soul said that depending on how far you've evolved in your spiritual evolution and your true understanding of the authentic nature of God, and once you reach the point where your orientation is towards loving and caring for others, be it nature or human beings, then you will begin to remember past life experiences and past lives to the degree that you can use them to help other people, and you can maintain empathy and compassion for yourself and keep it in the context that it doesn't disable you. Without a long to do, I've had many memories of past life experiences and investigated it very deeply, and I've hired past life regressionists to work with me. And so I'm very sure that these things are true because they've shown up many times in the work that I do, where I'm doing things, for example, during healings, but I've never been trained in this. And somehow when I'm doing a healing, all of a sudden the sense of I know what to do shows up. And I've been baffled myself, like, how did I know to do that? And what made me investigate it is because many of the people that I've done this healing work with have come back to me, and I didn't maybe talk to them for a few years, and have told me about wild and crazy things that happened to them after that healing, and how their whole life changed and illnesses went away, and being lost, all of a sudden now they had a sense of direction in life. And so I realized that I was being communicated from my own soul these skills that I had developed in past lives, but only came online because I was giving myself in service to support another person. And so when that kept happening, I said, I've got to figure out how this happening, because it's baffling to me, because I'm in a bit of a trance state when I'm doing this healing work. I'm not using my conscious, rational mind. I'm connected deeply to the soul of the individual. But some of these things left me confused inside of myself. Like, how in the world did I know to do that? And I did it naturally. I didn't have to sit and think about, do I do this? Do I do that? And so I just wanted to share with you that that's what I learned, that we don't have access to our past life memories until we reach a level of spiritual development, that we have enough empathy and compassion for ourselves and for others, that should we remember the lives we've lived and the things that we've done, we will not be disabled by it. We will be able to hold it in the space of empathy and compassion for ourselves and others. And we will realize that all of us have gone through these things.
And that does make sense to me, because for many of us, just the memories within this life are difficult enough to handle. And you multiply that by many other lives, perhaps when we were less conscious, it would make sense that it would be too much to handle from an evolutionary perspective.
Yeah, it could really just, imagine if you had a visceral memory of murdering people or being in wars and just wiping people out, and realizing later it was for the wrong reasons, or that you were misled, or that you were lied to, which is so common in military movements. That's why you're not allowed to ask questions. And that's why I got out of the military. I was a paratrooper in the 82nd Airborne Division, but when I could not ask the questions I had to ask to feel justified I knew that I was not in a place that I could participate and feel whole in my heart, and I had to leave. So I didn't re-up. I left. Well, guess what? Drew Cannoli is sitting here right here with me, and I'm going to try to sell him on Organifi's green juice. Drew, you got to try this stuff. My kids love it. I love it. And for a lot of people that are too busy to get good shop and find, proper organic greens, it's the way to go. It's fast, it's easy, and it tastes good.
Yep.
But since you made it, why don't you tell everyone else about it?
Yeah. So one of the things that Organifi strives for is transparency in labels.
That's a good idea.
We almost have 4 grams of the greens, organic greens, and then 3 grams of the superfood blend. Not to mention 600 milligrams of ashwagandha.
Yes.
300 milligrams is the clinical dose for lowering stress. And when we're not stressed out, we don't crave food. Right,
you don't crave junk.
You don't crave junk. Yeah. And because you don't crave junk, it actually helps support weight loss.
Yeah.
So naturally, and this is the first green juice that was, with the ashwagandha in it, and now it's glyphosate residue free. It's amazing.
You know what I like about this and all of your juice mixes of this style? One, they taste good. Two, I can get up out of my chair and in 32 seconds, I can have something that tastes good and feels good in my body and actually contributes to my mental stability and my ability to get work done, or to my weightlifting, or to my overall physiological adaptation to the stress of life.
Yeah, when we're stressed out, we don't produce testosterone as men.
Yes,
as much.
Shuts it way down.
So the ashwagandha helps with that. And one of my favorite mentors told me that it's a bioharmonizer.
It's a bioharmonizer for sure. We don't do biohacking around here. And that's why I love your products, because they are bioharmonizers. And that's what we all need, right?
So absolutely.
Thank you to Organifi and you for making such great products. I really love sharing them on my podcast, and my kids and my family use them daily. So this is the real deal. So if you want to get your green juice, you can go to Organifi, ORGANIFI.com/CHEK20. And on checkout, use the code CHEK20, get 20% off. And that's a damn good
family
deal.
Discount.
And your whole family will be the better for it. And you will enjoy the taste and feel good and know that you're doing something that your doctor won't do for you.
Absolutely.
Aho, great spirit.
Aho.
Aho. Thanks, buddy. Fascinating dialogue. I was so excited to have this dialogue with you, and also just to have this dialogue to share for the listeners, because having read enough of your work to see how your mind works, and looking at your references and seeing what you've studied and saying, okay, I'm right there with Mark, and I know what he's read, so I can see how his thoughts are getting shaped. But I also thought it would be fun for you to kind of experience some of my experiences and viewpoints, because they might be beneficial to you and to the listeners to hear, because we're both bringing up some very, very important things that we should all really deeply think about and question. I really believe, as Aristotle said, the unexamined life is not worth living. And I think today more than ever, we really need to ask deeper questions, because I think we're at a tipping point in the world where if we don't wake up and start asking, is it really true, on a lot of levels, that we're going to create, potentially a situation from which none of us can get back from.
Yeah, that question, is it really true, I would say is the basis of all of my work so far, of what's gone on in all of the books. Because what I'm realizing over and over again, with whether it's in the field of consciousness or politics or cosmology or otherwise, there are things that I believe to be true because someone told me that it was true. And usually that person had credentials. And I didn't think to question the assumptions underlying those beliefs. And now that I'm going into those assumptions and saying, well, why does the person say that's true, and actually look at the data and the philosophy and the logic, I'm seeing that there are flaws everywhere. And I do think this is part of the spiritual journey as well, is getting to truth. Part of it is actually finding out what's true, but there's also the Vedic principle of neti neti, not that. Which is, well, I don't know exactly what's true, but these things they're telling me are false. So we're narrowing down the set of possibilities as to what is true, and in the process, living with fewer falsehoods. And what I found is there's a liberation in that, of a shedding of falsehoods that allows us to be part of our truer selves. And I can't really describe it other than I am experiencing it with each falsehood, whether it's with regard to consciousness, which feels like it's very much embedded within my body, or our place in the cosmos, or how to think about health, things that you might not think of as being liberating. In shedding the falsehoods, I'm finding that they are liberating.
Yeah, I think, we could do a whole series of podcasts on the issue of truth, but I'll share with you what I use as my sort of inner compass and see how it aligns with you. Whenever I hear the truth, even if I don't like it, I have a sense of being brought into my center. There's a sense of alignment within me. And I have to be honest with myself. Like, I have to get my own biases out of the way. For example, when my mother was a Christian Scientist before she became a yogi, and it scared the hell out of me, because here I was as a little boy sitting in Sunday school being told all about how Jesus loves you and God loves you, but then being told you would burn in hell for any number of a long list of things. And it used to really disturb me to hear to have to sing Onward Christian Soldiers Marching Off to War with the cross of Jesus going on before. And I thought, well, in my 8-year-old mind, I was still rational enough to say, why would Jesus go to war when he's supposed to be the Son of God and love everybody? And when I would ask questions like that, I would get shut down and I would be told, you're here to listen, not talk. You have 2 ears and 1 mouth. Listen twice as much as you talk. All this kind of stuff that just really upset me. And I got to the point where I was actually scared because I couldn't believe that adults themselves weren't asking these questions. And I was so upset that I couldn't get answers to these questions. Then my mother joined the Self-Realization Fellowship Temple. I'll never forget the first time I went to a temple service. And I'm going to tell you how they begin all their prayer services. The service opens like this. Heavenly Father, Jesus Christ, Paramahansa Yogananda, Sri Yukteswar, Lahiri Mahashai, Babaji, Krishna, saints and sages of all religions, we humbly bow to you all. At that moment, it was like the lightning of love went through my whole body, and I realized I was safe for the first time. I was with people that really had space in themselves for all beliefs and all religions. And it was the first time I could ask any question I wanted to the monks. They would look me in the eyes, they would be present with me, and they always gave me an answer that seemed rational to me or felt true inside of me. So from the time of being a child, whenever I was hearing the truth, even if I didn't like it, something aligned inside of me, and I knew that it was the safer way to go. Because if I continued to believe a lie, then ultimately it would have an impact on the rest of my life that would lead me into more and more illusion.
Well, this notion of not being able to ask questions, we're seeing it not just in the realm of religion, but in the realm of politics and science. And to me, it's censorship. It's an automatic red flag. If a question cannot be asked, we have to ask, why is that so? Is the truth really that scary? And it's been really remarkable for me to see the bifurcation in society of those who support the censorship, to say that you're asking dangerous questions, whereas there are others who say you should be able to ask the questions. These are fundamental differences in authority, really.
Yeah, an ideology. It's really something that I think the world population needs to look seriously at, because in all the cultures in the last long time where you could not ask questions and could not speak about things that went against the rulers, we were dealing with fascism, we were dealing with dictatorships, we were dealing with communism, socialism, and none of those systems has ever fundamentally worked out very well. And all of them have killed millions of people for any number of reasons. And we can talk about this more in your upcoming book on that issue of politics, but I think we're at a tipping point in the evolution of humanity where we must grow up and be brave enough to ask the questions that have to be asked. Because if we don't ask the questions and get the right answers, all you got to do is look, A squared plus B squared is C squared. Being led by lies and not investigating the truth means you will be led by more lies, because there is no impetus to find the truth, and therefore your life becomes a reinforcement of a perpetual lie. And if you want to have an interesting afterlife experience and life review, one of the things you will see is all the times you knew you weren't living the truth, but you did it anyhow because you were too chicken shit to be brave enough to lead the way and pursue the truth. And that itself can be as painful as almost any other thing we can experience in an afterlife review. Fantastic dialogue, man. I'm so grateful to have you here and have this discussion, because, though you and I have looked into these things a lot, and this is sort of a part of our operating system now, it's very important, I think, for the public, the listeners, to really hear a dialogue like this and have the resources you're sharing, have all the resources you share in your books, which are very well written, and they're written in a way that it's not hard to follow, I must say. Like, unlike a lot of the books, like if you try to read Carl Jung or Rudolf Steiner or any number of these people that are very, very deep and profound, most people don't have the patience or the discipline to learn the language that these guys use, and they all write at very deep levels. But your books are written at a level I think almost any high school student could read them comfortably and understand them. And so I really applaud you for that. We're going to end the first segment. The members can go to the membership segment platform and get that. For those of you that are not members, you can go to paulchek.com. You can sign up for the podcast membership. It's less than $8 a month. You get the extended play. You get to have Q&A sessions with occasional guests that will commit the time for that. And so you get a lot for your money. And most of you know my podcast is not fluffy. It's very educational. That's the intention of the podcast. So Mark, just for those that aren't members, can you share any resources you want to share? Where would you recommend people get your books? Any services you offer? Anything that you'd like to share as we end the public segment?
I would just say all of my books are available on Amazon, and they are in hard copy, Kindle, and Audible formats. I narrate all the books myself.
Awesome.
And again, they cover the topics of consciousness science, spiritual awakening, political theory, UFOs, the Great Reset, medicine, and cosmology. So many topics, and you can see what you're interested in. And the last thing I'll say is I have a podcast series that was only one season, produced in 2019, called Where is My Mind? And I interviewed many of the people who have studied things that we talked about today, Paul, like near-death experiences and children with past life memories. And so you get to hear from those scientists themselves in short snippets.
And it's still available.
It's still available on Apple Podcast and Spotify. It's only 8 episodes. Where is my mind?
Excellent. Any website you want to direct people to?
My website is just my name, markgober.com, markgober.com, and it has more info on the books and the podcast.
Mark, fantastic. I'm very grateful for your work. I'm grateful for this opportunity to have this time to dialogue with you. I'm excited at the thought that you might continue writing these books, because I think that you have a gift, and your gift is that you're willing to enter beginner's mind and question everything and not have a bias that causes you to cherry pick information to only get the outcome that supports your belief system. And it's very hard to find an author that's open-minded and open-hearted enough and truly scientific enough to be willing to find the highest truth they can find. Because, there's an old saying you've probably heard, it's very hard to change a man's belief system when his paycheck depends on it. And it seems to me that your paycheck doesn't depend on sales of books. Therefore, you're really willing to open your heart and share what you know to be the highest truth you can find, and willing to question your own belief system. That's highly commendable.
Well, Paul, thank you so much for saying that. I want to comment a few things here that might be valuable to your audience, just because it's been part of my journey, is that I've had to learn more and more to be open and willing to be wrong in a public way, which was not part of my training academically, professionally before, where I can say, I don't agree with myself where I was a few years ago on this topic. And that's okay, because I'm more committed to the truth than anything else. And I often feel in some ways uncomfortable doing so many interviews and lectures like this, where people might be looking to me as a source of information or even knowledge, because the more I learn, the more I actually feel like I really don't know. So what I try to do when I speak, as much as I can, is to share what I have learned, but also caveat it. So I have learned X, Y, and Z based on these sources, but this knowledge I have is provisional, and I'm still willing to change my views. So I hope your audience takes our conversation that way, and everything that I'm bringing forth is, this is what I've learned, but I'm also willing to change my perspectives on what I've discussed.
Well, I live the same way myself, and I think it's the only way we can really enjoy the journey. God's the great explorer, and that's what we're all here doing. Here's a paradox for you. As the unconscious, God can't be conscious of what it's doing. That's why it's called unconscious. And as the superconscious, then everything is possible all at the same time. There's nothing you can know, right? In a superpositional state, there is no collapse of the wave function. That's all possibilities at once. So if you say what exists between the unconscious and the superconscious, it's conscious entities like human beings that are actually having the experience of being embodied by the habits of God, the unconscious, but having the potential to hold an intention for about anything and collapse the wave function into a possibility. And that's what we're doing when we're asking questions and doing the work to go get the answers. We're holding the intention And I believe we magnetize ourselves to the people, places, and resources that are in alignment with our honest, heartfelt intention. And that's why whenever you have a real intention to learn something, all of a sudden you start becoming aware of certain authors, or people start talking to you, or you come across ads for things that you never even saw before, like, the becoming a member of the Noetic Institute, for example. That just pops up in your inbox and you're like, oh my God. And you start looking and your mind is blown and you realize, oh wow, people have been talking about this stuff forever and I had no idea. And so I think that's the real beauty of the beginner's mind. My dream is to inspire all my students and all my listeners to hold that position because I really believe that's what learning is meant to be. I don't think we were meant to be indoctrinated. I think we were meant to be taught. And that's why I love the Waldorf system that Steiner developed, because it really teaches you how to think, not what to think. So thank you very much for this first segment. I'm super excited to enter the segment. Those of you that are members, get ready, because me and Mark got lots to go into yet. So it's going to be a juicy ride. If you want to get the rest of the conversation, it's worth 1,000 times more than the $8 for the monthly membership. Go to paulchek.com. Thank you to my sponsors for all your love and support. Thank you to any of you for buying products from the sponsors. As you know, I don't sell anything on the podcast that isn't something my family doesn't use and I don't fully believe in. Anything you buy from the sponsors supports you, supports the planet, supports regenerative farming and organic farming, and a little commission goes to the podcast so I can continue to find amazing people like Mark to have dialogues with. Lots of love to all of you. Thanks for joining us on our journey today. And I'll see you on the other half of the podcast where we continue with Mark. Mark, thanks for joining me for the first segment.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you for listening to Spirit Gym with Paul Chek and today's guest, Mark Gober. If you'd like to continue listening to their conversation, you can join Paul's Spirit Gym podcast membership. When you subscribe, you'll get access to exclusive extended episodes of Spirit Gym with Paul Chek, members-only Q&A opportunities with Paul, access to the podcast members forum within the Spirit Gym community where you can interact with other passionate listeners, and the chance to purchase exclusive Spirit Gym merchandise. Your support helps keep the show running and allows us to bring you even better content. So if you're ready to dive deeper and unlock all these amazing extras, head over to paulchek.com/podcast and become a Spirit Gym podcast member today. You can find Mark Gober online at markgober.com. That's MarkGober.com. On Facebook and X at Mark Gober Author. On Instagram at Mark Gober_author. And on Telegram at Mark Gober Official. The complete list of books in Mark's Upside Down series is listed on the show notes page at paulchek.com/podcast, or you can visit any bookstore online or in person. On the show notes page, you can also find details of the special offers from our premier sponsors, Bioptimizers, Paleo Valley, Wild Pastures, and Organifi, as well as links to Paul's social media, his YouTube channels, and his blog. And finally, if you enjoyed today's episode, please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and a warm review on the podcast platform of your choice. This podcast is available on Apple Podcast, Spotify, Amazon Music, Audible, and YouTube.